Okay, we're back. In the last lesson we finished up connecting our rig, and we have a fairly functional rig here. So what we're going to do now is move on to doing some basic animation, which is going to double as a bit of a debugging test for the rig. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and go to File, New Scene, and then I'm going to use Maya's referencing system and go to File, Create Reference, and I'm going to choose the Boxosaurus rig. Click Reference, and that'll bring that in. I'm going to turn it into shaded mode. And now while we're animating, we don't really want to see any of these joints and stuff that are sticking out of the side, so we can just go ahead and turn them off. And we can do the same thing with our IK handles, just to make the scene look a little tidier. It's always good to try and keep a tidy workflow. It just helps out in pretty much every way possible, really. If you've got too much stuff going on, you can never find what you're looking for. So, okay, we're ready to start. I'll just go ahead and create a file name. So we're going to call this Boxosaurus Run, and just give it a number 01. Okay, save as. So now with a lot of walk cycles, what people generally do is do a start position and an end position and then work in between those. I generally do things slightly differently, particularly if I'm trying to work to a deadline. In the end, everything comes down to a cycle, which is generally up, down, left or right. So I like to work in that sort of manner. It's a little difficult to explain right now, but I'll show you the workflow and you can choose whether you like to use this or whether you like to use the more traditional style of creating each separate pose on the different keys. Okay, so first of all, we're going to go down to a key 0, and we're going to do a nice amiable walk. So I'm going to take it up to 32 frames for our loop. And the next thing I'm going to do is just go to our playback speed and check that I've got real time selected. I generally like to start with the legs, so we're going to look at those first. I'll select both our controllers, and so the main difference between this is that everything is animated in a very mechanical way, but you'll see how that smooths out later on. So we're going to animate both these legs together. So we're going to come along, put these 5 units. It looks about good. Actually, we're going to bring that back to 4.5, and we're going to come over to our key 0 and set a key there. And at the end, we'll set another key there. And now the point of a cycle is that the first frame and the last frame is exactly the same. So you just have to make sure that at all times, if you change your first frame or your last frame, you have to change the other as well. And so we're going to create our opposite pose, which is at frame 16. And we're going to bring it back here around -9.5, looks pretty good. And we'll just play that back. And we've got this lovely looking sliding motion, which doesn't look like a walk cycle at all. But we're going to start playing around with that. First thing we're going to do is go to our perspective graph editor split screen and hit F to frame up our curves. And okay, so we can see the basic sort of shape of what's going on here. I'm just going to make that a little bit smaller. And so from here, we actually want the foot to slide along the ground, and then we want it to lift up. So what we're going to do is at frame 20, we're going to lift the foot up a bit. Frame 28, we're going to do the same thing. But if you notice in the graph editor, we haven't got a keyframe for our translate. So now our feet are actually sitting off the ground. So we're just going to fix that and go to our translate Y and bring that back down to the ground. So now we have our basic sort of walk. It looks rather mechanical at the moment, but we'll start adding in variation to it to make it look a little more interesting. So the next thing with our feet, we'll set keyframes on start, end, and finish, just to be sure. And we're going to put a little bit of rotation in here. Hit F to frame. And we'll put in a bit of curl and we'll close those feet together a bit. Okay, great. So we have this nice little bit of a kickback of the toes when the foot comes up. And what we want to do is actually get some weight pressed down on the feet. So how we're going to do that is just by adding a little bit of spread into the toes. So we're going to come along here to frame 8 and just add in a little bit of spread. Add in a little bit of spread. And now you'll see that we get that extra little bit of animation in the toes to make it look like there's more weight coming down. But without the rest of the body movement, that still looks kind of average and ordinary. But before we move on to the rest, I'll show you the basic sort of setup of why animating in this particular way can be quite powerful. So first of all, we're going to just make sure that we've got everything selected, highlight all of these curves, and then we're going to click this button here, which is post-infinity cycle, and we're going to also click pre-infinity cycle. And then what we can do there is grab one of the feet and shift and drag along the time slider to select all of these keys along here, and then drag that until we get to frame 16, which is half of 32. And as you'll notice, when I play back, we've got both our feet moving, and we've only done half the work that you would do normally. And so this is why I find that this way of animating can be very, very time efficient, especially if you've got some rather nasty deadlines. So this is the basic reason for why I'm choosing to do this tutorial in this manner. So I'm going to go and stop that and just undo until all my frames are back at the starting position, and I'm going to start working on some body movement. So the first position looks good, so I'm going to put in a key there and keep the replicated key back at frame 32. Now for the body, we want to keep our midpoint also the same as our last frames, and it's actually at our quarter points at frames 8 and also at frames 24 that we want to get some variation. So we actually just want the body to come up a bit. So we're going to bring that up to 0.7. And I'm going to come across to frame 24 and put in 0.7. And now you see we've got this nice movement here of it just bobbing up and down, which in itself doesn't look like a whole lot of use, but we'll start adding in the rest of the translates and rotates to get more interesting action. So I'll frame up this in the graph editor. So what we want to do is have the body tilted down a bit. So this is our down action for the body, and this is our up action. So our downward tilt is going to be 3 degrees. And we'll go along and put in 3 degrees at our start, mid, and end. And then at our quarter marks, we're going to go back to 0. Actually, we might put in -3 just to bring up the variation a little bit more. And you can frame that in your viewport. You see you've got these nice waves here, which will be our movement. And at the moment, that looks very excessive, so I'm going to dial those down a little bit. I'm going to put in a value of 2, -2, 2, -2, and 2 again. And as you can see, working in whole numbers for something like this, particularly if you're just debugging a rig, is very useful. And then later on, what you can do is you can change up the values a little bit more and tweak it. But when you're just setting up the initial run through, then it's good to work in whole numbers because it's far more efficient. Okay, so we've got a bit of motion here. It looks a little bit mechanical, but again, if I just quickly shift select all of those and offset that, then you'll see that we're starting to get our movement right. But what I'm looking at now is I want to get a bit more actual translation rather than rotation in this animation. So I'm going to go back, undo those steps. I'm going to just click on Rotate X and scale all of these down in the graph editor by holding Shift and middle mouse dragging. And if you'll notice, I've actually got some uneven points here, so that's at roughly -1, and so I'm going to go through, put that at -1, -1, 1, 1, and 1. Okay, that's a little nicer for the rotation, and so we're going to look at the translation again. What we might do to give it a little more variation is actually select all of these downward points and go back to our translate and pull them down so that we get a little more actual up and down action, which is probably a little too much, so we'll reduce that. This is why working in the graph editor can be so easy, because you can work on several frames at once, especially when you've got repeated values. Okay, so now what we want is to just create a little bit of up and down movement in the tail as well. So we're going to go ahead and place some keyframes on each of those. And this is our up pose, so we're going to go to our rotation and just rotate those up a bit at, looks like around 6 degrees. That might be a little bit much. We'll go to 3. And at frame 24, we'll put in a value of 3. And we've got a little bit of nice bobbing up and down motion. It still doesn't look very natural, but with using an offset procedure like this, at this point in time, it will look a little awkward to start with. And so we're also going to go with our side-to-side movement, which is going to be our rotation in X, so in Y, sorry. So we're going to go with our, let's say 15 degrees off to the side. So that'll be 15 degrees there. And we're going to go at -15 in the middle. So you'll see that we have this very mechanical sort of movement, but we're starting to get movement across the entire board. I'm actually going to come along and play with these values a little bit, put in -2 into our center and end points. Okay, great. And now what we want to do is add in a little bit of movement here. So we're going to put in some translate Y, just to get the chest bobbing up and down, to make it feel like it's got a little more weight than what it does at the moment. So we're going to add in keyframes at our start, end, and mid points, and then at our quarter points, we're just going to translate that up a bit. If you see, we're also getting some Z action in there. I'm just going to zero that out and put that up to 0.4. And at frame 24, I'm going to also put that up to 24. And so we're getting a little bit of extra movement. With the head, we're going to also do some bobbing up and down. So I'm just going to add in our starter keyframes. And then at frame 8, I'll just lower that a bit. And as you see, the head is already naturally moving forward. We'll take that out and go to -0.8, and at frame 24, -0.8. Okay, we're getting our nice little bobbing motion. So we're going to put in some rotation with the head as well. So we'll bring that up, and we're going to rotate the head backwards a little bit. We'll put that at 9. And the same at the other quarter point, 9. And so we have a bit of movement going on here. While we're at it, we'll put in some rotations on the arms, we'll just get in some basic values for now. So rotating in Z, we'll give that 5 degrees of motion. At frame 24, 5 degrees of motion. And selecting the shoulders. And again, I'm just going to put in, so we'll put in 3 there, and 3 there. Okay, and so what we've got at the moment still isn't looking like an actual walking dinosaur yet, but this is where you can start putting in all the offset values, and this is where this style of animation really comes into its own. So what we're going to do is, firstly, we're going to offset this leg, so we're going to drag that along 16 frames. And now the rest of these controls, I'm just going to go ahead and shift select each of these. I'll select that one last. Okay, and with all those selected, I can highlight them all, and we're going to repeat that in post-infinity, and we're going to pre-infinity cycle as well. Okay, and now what we can do is we can go, okay, this body needs to offset a little bit. So we're going to offset it by 2 frames. This chest, we're going to offset that one by 4 frames. And the tail, that's going to be 4 frames as well. This next tail part is going to be 6 frames. And this last tail end is going to be offset by 8 frames. And already you can start seeing the movement as I'm scrolling through here. And the head we're going to offset, let's try 4 frames for now. Now if I play that through, you'll see that we're starting to get a little more weighted feel in around the rest of the body. But the thing is, once we select these, we can't actually access all of the keys because our key that used to be at frame 32 is now at frame 34, which we can no longer get to. But there's an easy solution for that. If you come down here and change your last keyframe to frame 63, this is actually an easier way to see your cycle as you're not getting a double up of frames at the start and end. So we can play that through, and we now have access to all our keys again. And because this is all cycling, we can actually change this up to however much we want, so let's say 200, and it will continue walking very happily right up all through those frames. But we're going to dial this back to 63 while we're working. Okay, so we need to add some offset onto our arms because they're moving at probably the wrong time. We want a little bit of offset, not as much as the upper body, but we'll offset these by 4 frames, and we'll offset these by 2. Now this offset or delayed reaction is just a really easy way of getting that extra weighted feel. Now this is a very basic walk cycle at the moment, and when you're actually doing a walk cycle for a production, if you're creating a character walk cycle that's fully skinned and everything, you'll probably want to spend a lot more time than we will on this, but this will just give you a bit of an idea of how you can efficiently set it up. So one of the things that we want to do is, at the moment, it is walking dead center. We want the body to rock from side to side a little bit. So we're going to go into our hip control. Now what this is great for is the hips will move from side to side, but it won't pull the whole body from side to side. So we're going to go in and put in a keyframe at 0, at 32, and at 16. And then every time one of the feet is up, we can actually just move that to the opposite side so that you can see the transfer of weight. So we're going to put in a value of, let's put in a value of 1. And we'll go to frame 24 and put in -1. And now, as you see, we get the first part of that animation, but we haven't yet cycled it. So we're going to select all of that and post-infinity and pre-infinity cycle. Now, with this, we're actually seeing a bit of a jitter, or it's not really a jitter, but an awkward movement every time we get to this repeat section. And that's because our graph is not looking smooth. So if I frame this up and just isolate our translate Z, you'll see that we have this slowing down motion here, which is what we don't want. We want it to continue straight through like what this point in the middle is doing. So we're going to select both of those and change to our spline tangent. And that just fixes that up and makes it look a lot nicer. So that's that in place, although it's maybe looking like it's got a little too much movement in there, so we're going to dial that back. We're going to bring it to 0.5 and to negative 0.5. Okay, so now we've got our side-to-side rocking. We probably want a little bit of that transferring up the rest of the body, so we're going to put a bit of rock onto the actual hip control as well. So we'll drag that across a little bit. We won't put nearly as much, so we'll put 0.3 and negative 0.3. And again, we want to isolate the translate X and frame it up and make sure that this curve is continuous and without that silly little slowdown that was just messing everything up. Okay, great. So we're starting to get what's looking like a nice walk cycle here. And what we might do is put a little opposing side-to-side motion here. So we'll go into our translate X and pull that across to the side. Sorry, the wrong frame. Pull that across to the side. And so we've got, we'll put in 0.4. And here we'll put in negative 0.4. And we'll just frame this up and make sure that this is nice and smooth. Okay, so we've got our nice bit of movement happening here. And what we're going to look at next is actually we want to get a little more rotation back into this joint here. So there is a lot of going backwards and forth until you come across the values that you want, but that's all part of the animation process. So we're going to put in negative 3, ooh, that's a little too much, negative 2, negative 2, and see what that looks like. Yes, so now we're getting a much heavier looking walk. And as you notice, there are a couple of things that we can't control at the moment. So there are things like the jaw here, which would be great to be able to move from this control on the head, but we can't actually touch that because it's only controlled by a joint. So what we could do is show joints and animate, and we can animate the jaw a bit and give a bit of jaw wobble as he's moving, but that's not very neat in terms of animation. We need to be animating only on the curves. So I'm going to save this project now, and we're going to come back and look at how you can fix up your rig and then update it into your scene. So I'm just going to go Control Save, and I'll see you in the next lesson.